Okay, so the next time you grab a cold beer or maybe pour yourself a glass of fine wine, you're probably not thinking about global supply chain management, right? But it turns out the drinks sitting in our fridges are tied to some pretty massive geographic risks. In this explainer, we're going to uncover exactly how the beverage industry manages these threats, and we'll track the fascinating operational divide hiding right behind your favorite labels. Let's kick things off with a pretty basic but totally crucial question. Why do these massive, multi-billion-dollar beverage companies operate so differently in the physical world? I mean, it's not just a matter of finding a cheap, empty warehouse. Their underlying business models actually dictate radically different physical footprints all across the globe. Here is where it gets really interesting, because there is a huge geographic split at the heart of our story today. Think about it. Breweries fundamentally need to sprawl out. Beer is heavy, it's mostly water, and it's super expensive to ship long distances. So what do? They build multiple manufacturing facilities to sit right next to their diverse consumer markets. But vintners and distillers, well, they operate with a completely different philosophy. They are locked to their historic terroir. You can't just pick up a 200-year-old vineyard and move it closer to a new city without fundamentally changing the entire product. Now, these wildly different footprints force companies to track their risks like hawks. Because a brewery is constantly expanding into new, sometimes resource-strained markets, and a vineyard is locked into the changing climate of its historical location, they both face massive operational threats. To handle this, they rely on strict frameworks, like the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, or SASB standards, to track these environmental and social risks and ultimately protect their long-term cash flows. To make sense of the whole shebang, we'll break this explainer down into 5 clear, measurable areas: geography and operations, the water scarcity threat, managing global energy, sourcing and supply chains, and finally, packaging impacts. All right, diving right into section 1, geography and operations. How do we actually measure the physical footprint of these giant beverage companies? Well, whether we're talking about a historic, localized vineyard or a massive global brewery spanning 5 continents, you've got to track specific activity metrics to understand the sheer scale of the operation. By measuring the millions of hectoliters sold, counting every single production facility, and logging the total fleet road kilometers traveled, investors and operators get a solid baseline. A global brewery is obviously going to have massive facility counts and millions of road kilometers to track, whereas a single-site distiller's footprint will look entirely different. But both absolutely need that baseline. Moving on to section 2, the water scarcity threat. Because no matter your strategy, whether you're aggressively expanding or historically anchored, everyone depends on one massive shared resource: water. Water is literally the main ingredient here, so managing it is completely non-negotiable. Companies must report their water usage with absolute precision, tracking it in thousands of cubic meters. And there's a really vital distinction they make here: water withdrawn from rivers or city pipes versus water consumed. Think about this. It takes roughly 4 to 5 pints of water just to brew one single pint of beer. The water actually evaporated during the brewing process or locked inside the final bottled product is consumed. That's a precise measure of the net drain on a local ecosystem. And tracking this becomes incredibly urgent when we look at where these companies are actually operating. The industry defines baseline water stress using the World Resources Institute's Aqueduct tool. If a location is using over 40% of its available water, it's flagged as a high-stress zone. If it's over 80%, that's an extremely high-stress zone. So think back to our geographic divide for a second. If a global brewery needs multiple facilities to access diverse markets, expanding into these highly stressed regions to capture market share is honestly like walking right into a major operational trap. Operating in these stressed regions, well, it triggers an absolute cascade of risks. We are talking about environmental constraints, like seasonal droughts literally halting production. Then there's direct competition for water with local towns. If the community feels you're draining their drinking water for your beverage plant, you are going to lose your social license to operate. And once that happens, it's a domino effect. Regulatory restrictions kick in, permits are lost, and your cash flow dries up immediately. Okay, section 3, managing global energy needs. Let's zoom out from water for a second and look at the power required to keep these sprawling breweries and historic distilleries actually running. Turning raw agricultural crops into finished alcohol takes a massive amount of heat, cooling, and electricity. Companies have to track their total energy consumed in gigajoules, and they break it all down into grid electricity, direct fossil fuel usage, and renewable energy. For a global brewery with, say, 50 plants, tracking this shift toward renewables across multiple different regional grids is a huge undertaking. but it's absolutely vital to insulate the business against volatile fossil fuel prices and to prep for any future emissions regulations. Next up, Section 4, Sourcing and Supply Chains. Because a company's operational footprint goes way, way beyond the walls of the brewery and deep into global agriculture. This brings us to Tier 1 suppliers. These are the direct partners out there providing the raw ingredients, the sugar, the barley, the corn, the grapes. Since the beverage industry takes these raw crops and transforms them into premium products, the parent companies are held entirely responsible for monitoring the practices of these direct suppliers. A failure out there in the cornfields, that immediately becomes a failure for the multi-billion-dollar parent brand. To keep tabs on this, beverage brands run really rigorous social and environmental audits on their suppliers, and when they audit, they categorize issues strictly. A major nonconformance is severe. We're talking underage or forced labor, immediate health and safety dangers, or serious environmental destruction. A minor nonconformance might just be an isolated incident with minimal immediate risk. Reporting these rates transparently is absolutely crucial because major issues hiding deep in the supply chain can lead to massive reputational damage and some pretty hefty fines. But they don't just point out problems. They are on a strict clock to actually fix them. The standards demand strict corrective action timelines. Once an issue is flagged, major nonconformances have to be resolved within 90 days. Minor issues get a 60-day window. This really proves that global supply chain management isn't just about writing up a polite code of conduct and putting it on a website. It requires constant, boots-on-the-ground enforcement. And bringing it all back to our earlier point about water, companies also have to quantify the percentage of these agricultural ingredients sourced from those baseline water-stressed regions. It's not just the water used inside the bottling plant that matters. It's the water used to grow the ingredients miles and miles away. If a historic vineyard, which, remember, can't simply relocate, relies on local grape suppliers who are suddenly facing extreme long-term drought, their entire product line is structurally at risk. They literally cannot just pack up and move. Finally, Section 5, Packaging Impacts. Let's look at the very last stage of the product's life cycle and how it actually gets into the hands of the consumer. Even if a beverage brand doesn't actually make its own glass bottles or aluminum cans, they are still on the hook for that packaging's footprint. They track the total weight in metric tons, the exact percentage made from recycled or renewable materials, and what is actually recyclable or compostable. For breweries shipping millions of hectoliters across those long road networks we talked about earlier, shaving even just a few grams off of a glass bottle drastically reduces transportation costs and exposure to raw material price swings. Now, it's worth noting exactly what they're actually measuring here. The scope specifically includes primary packaging, so the actual bottle or can touching the liquid, and secondary packaging, like that cardboard six-pack holder. Notice what's purposely excluded here: the shipping pallets and the shrink wrap used in background transport. This hyper-focused tracking ensures that companies are optimizing the materials that actually end up in your hands and, hopefully, your recycling bin. Ultimately, the big takeaway from this explainer really boils down to this standard guideline: tracking water, monitoring energy grids, auditing supply chains, and weighing packaging. None of this is just PR or for show. It is fundamentally about mitigating very real physical risks, lowering operating costs, and ensuring long-term profitability in a world with finite resources. It really makes you stop and wonder, doesn't it? The next time you crack open a beer brewed specifically for fast market access, or pour a glass of wine that's tied to a changing historic climate, think about the immense data, the strict supplier audits, and the global risk management that went into producing it. What invisible geographic realities and operational risks are bottled inside your drink?